I'm Charlie Creme, ESPN.com, women's college basketball bracketologist, and this is my bracket. We're going to start in Greenville, upper left, Greenville 1, with top overall seed South Carolina. We're going to move them on to the second round. Now, the 8-9 game is a little more interesting, but I think we're going to go with South Florida in a really close game between those two. Oklahoma, big offense. They're going to move on against Portland into round 2. And UCLA, great guards, well coached, have UCLA moving on to round 2 as well. So we've got chalk there in the upper half of the Greenville 1 bracket. Now let's go to the bottom half. Creighton against first 4 winner Illinois. We're going to move Illinois in an upset over Creighton, last year's darling in the NCAA tournament. Not this year. We moved the Fighting Illini along. And Notre Dame fighting some injury issues with Olivia Miles, their point guard, but still enough to get through Southern Utah for sure. We're going to go Arizona here to move on to round 2 against West Virginia, and Maryland big over Holy Cross in a blowout, and the Terps move on. So now we're going to move over to the upper right, Greenville 2. Indiana, the top seed there, they easily move on against Tennessee Tech. And Oklahoma State kind of outshoots Miami and gets into round 2 as well. Here's an upset, another one for you. I'm going to take Florida Gulf Coast to knock off Pac-12 tournament champion Washington State to move on to the second round. And Villanova is the team that moves on in the bottom part of that bracket to get on to round 2. We'll go to the bottom half of Greenville 2, another Big Ten team, Michigan, but also another upset. I like UNLV to move on as the 11 seed. LSU, the 3 seed, easily over Hawaii. Another interesting matchup, a 7-10. It's been a tough season for NC State, and I think perhaps the tough season continues as Princeton upsets the Wolfpack and gets into the second round. And Utah, co-champs in the regular season of the Pac-12, move on to play in round 2. Now we're going to go to Seattle 3, where the top seed is Virginia Tech. First time they've ever been a number 1 seed, and they certainly move on against Chattanooga to get into the second round. USC, South Dakota State, I'm going to go with the 9 there. The Jackrabbits get on to play Virginia Tech in the second round, and we're going to take Iowa State, big offense. Ashley Jones, one of the best players in the country, moving on to round 2. And Tennessee, Atlantic 10 tournament champion St. Louis goes down to the Lady Vols. And there is the top half of the Seattle 3 region. Bottom half, North Carolina, Purdue. Purdue the winner of the first 4. But we're going to go with Carolina, an underseeded team in my mind. Should have been higher than a 6. They move on. Ohio State, starting to play real good basketball again. They move on against James Madison, the Sun Belt champs. And Baylor, not a great Baylor season, but certainly a good enough team playing in stores to get ahead to the round 2. And Connecticut playing at home, a 2nd seed, kind of a rarity for UConn. But the Huskies move on in what's been an interesting season for them. And then we're going to hear more about the Huskies as we move forward. And now we move on to Seattle 4, where the top seed is Stanford. They easily move on against Sacred Heart. No big 16 versus 1 upsets this year. Gonzaga, Ole Miss. Ole Miss is a program on the rise. Got to the NCAA tournament last year. This time they actually win a game. Louisville is going to move on against Drake. And we're going to take Texas pretty easily over East Carolina. That's the top half of Seattle 4. Now let's move on to the bottom half. Another upset, another 6-11. I've got a lot of those. I think Middle Tennessee is going to take down Colorado, score a lot of points, and move on to round 2. I'm also going to take a lower seed here in Georgia. Oh, we skipped the team. We'll go back. We'll go back and handle Duke. We wanted to give a little more suspense for the Duke fans, but we're going to take Duke to beat Iona and move on to play Middle Tennessee. And then Iowa against Southeast Louisiana. Big things ahead for the Hawkeyes, and this one becomes pretty easy. And they move on to round 2. So now we've got our Sweet 16 set. Let's go back up to the Greenville 1 region, and now the matchups get a little more difficult. Not so difficult for South Carolina, though. They move on and get into the Sweet 16 easily over South Florida. Now we're going to go Oklahoma, UCLA. This is one of the most interesting games, I think, in round 2. And we're going to go with Oklahoma to pull the surprise, a slight surprise, and get on to play South Carolina. Illinois and Notre Dame, a somewhat interesting matchup. It's been a great season for Illinois, but Notre Dame's just going to be too much, and they're going to move on there as well. And then Arizona, Maryland, too much firepower for the Terps, and the Terps are your winner, and they move on. So let's now move down. We're going to take a look at Seattle 4 and what's going to happen here in the second round. Stanford certainly the favorite over Ole Miss, and we're going to put the Cardinal ahead. Texas as well. Too much on defense for Louisville, and shutting down Haley Van Lith is going to be Rory Harmon's job, and I think she's going to do it very well there. Duke, as much as they struggle on offense, I think we're going to see the Blue Devils move on, and as I said, big things ahead for Iowa. So we're going to have the Hawkeyes move on there. Let's take a look now. We'll go back up to Greenville 2, where Indiana had moved on, and they're going to move on again. We're going to take the Hoosiers to be there in the Sweet 16, and we're going to take Villanova and the upset ride of Florida Gulf Coast in a nice 1-4 matchup there. LSU also doesn't let the upstart Lady Rebels move on any further, and we're going to have Utah do the same to Princeton and move on to the Sweet 16, and a great season for Utah. And then we're going to slide ourselves down, and now we've got to figure out the Seattle 3 region Sweet 16, and top seed Virginia Tech does move on against South Dakota State. Tennessee playing at home, that's going to be the advantage over Iowa State, and I think Tennessee moves on to play the Hokies. This is another interesting game. As I said, North Carolina underseeded. Ohio State, as a 3 seed, though, can really turn teams over and is really playing good basketball. I think they're good enough playing at home in Columbus to move on. And UConn, now that they're healthy, now that AZ Fudd is back, is moving on as well. So that's going to take us now to we're going to have some Sweet 16 teams to select now. This is where things get really fun. South Carolina, though, physically dominant, the best team in the country, out-rebounds teams like crazy. In fact, gets half of their own misses, and that's going to be way too much for a physically inferior team like Oklahoma. South Carolina moves on to the Elite Eight. Maryland, again, too much firepower, even for Notre Dame, and the Terps move on for a rematch with South Carolina, a game that happened earlier this year. Stanford is too much for Texas. Texas doesn't score enough points to keep up with the Cardinal, and I think they move on. And then Iowa, this could be a big margin. Duke plays really good defense, but Iowa's offense is just one of the best we've seen in a long time, and the Hawkeyes move on. So let's head to our next selections here. Well, we don't want to jump ahead to the Elite Eight just yet, so let's go back up to the Sweet 16 in Greenville 2. Or rather, let's hit Seattle 3 first and see where we are. Indiana, top seed, really good offense, really efficient team. They're in the Elite Eight. I'm putting LSU to slightly upset Utah. That's not a big upset, but let's put the Tigers in the Elite Eight. Virginia Tech beat Tennessee earlier in the year. They're going to do it again and move on to the Elite Eight. And UConn, despite the fact that Ohio State really turns teams over with their defense, and UConn's had a little trouble with turnovers, UConn is still the favorite there to get on to the Sweet 16, or rather to the Elite Eight. So now we've got to pick our final 4 teams. So let's get back and check out what we've got here in the Elite Eight. South Carolina and Maryland. South Carolina's just too good. Maryland's a great team and played South Carolina reasonably well early in the season. And they could play them tough here, but not tough enough. South Carolina moves on. Stanford, Iowa. This is a matchup of the 4th best team in the country, according to the committee, and the 5th best team in the country. I think the 5th best team is actually better, and I have Iowa moving on to the Final Four. We don't want to jump ahead to the championship just yet. We've got to finish off our Final Four here first. So let's head to pick our next part of the bracket on the right side. Indiana, LSU. This is a season that Indiana's been looking at for a long, long time, and the Hoosiers are going to come through and get to the Final Four. Virginia Tech, UConn. This is a really good Virginia Tech team, but with no NCAA tournament experience to speak of after losing in round 1 last year. And it's a UConn team with just tons of it, both on the sidelines and on the court. And UConn, despite all of the things that went on this season, I have moving on to the Final Four. So now we got to get to the real nitty-gritty. Here's our Final Four. South Carolina, Iowa, Indiana, UConn. 2 fabulous matchups. I think the player of the year, the people on the Aaliyah Boston side, the people on the Caitlin Clark side, this is a dream matchup. But South Carolina is 32-0 for a reason. I talked about their defense. I talked about their rebounding. South Carolina moves on to the championship game. Indiana, UConn, wow, what a fabulous game between 2 great offenses. I'd be really curious to see how AZ Fudd comes along in this this NCAA tournament, and if she can get her Huskies all the way to the championship game. But I don't think it's going to be quite enough. And the Hoosiers, who've been the second best team in the country all season long, are going to get to the championship game. So a little bit of a different flavor with the Hoosiers in the championship game, but not a different flavor with the champion. South Carolina takes care of business, wins it for the 2nd year in a row, and the Gamecocks are my national champion.